My name is Daniel. I went to WashU in St. Louis. I've got some fun facts. The first one, less consequential, but I sneeze when I eat dark chocolate, but only once. I'm not allergic to it. I can eat as much as I want. I'll just sneeze just once right at the beginning, and then we're good. That's fact number one. Number two, I'm very into journaling and systems, and I've had this ongoing system that involves my journal that I write in every night and my digital notes and various times that I will ingest the journal entries and put them into my notes and so on. And that's been going on for the last 8 years.
Wow.
Those are my facts.
Awesome.
Excited to be here.
Two very interesting facts. So, hello everyone. That's Daniel Sosebee. Hope I got that right. An alumni of Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, or WashU for short, which is how we'll be referring to the institution throughout this episode, where he actually majored in computer science. Today, we'll be hearing a little more about him and the choices he's made, the lessons he's learned along the way, as well as, I'm sure, nuggets of insight and wisdom and reflections on the journey so far for all the young high schoolers listening who are about to embark on this journey of university and then get into the quote-unquote real world. So, welcome to the podcast, Uni Unveiled. I'm your host, Arya Tharod, currently studying at Minerva University. And welcome, Daniel. Thank you for joining me today. Excited for the chat.
I'm excited too. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. And before I dive in, just two quick things I'd love to start this episode with is number one, gratitude. So thank you for helping me hit this important milestone, which is the 25th episode of Uni Unveiled. And I'm sure a lot more exciting conversations to come. It's been a lot of learning and growth from my end. And sort of, I feel that nothing happens by chance. And so I feel like there's a reason that this was the 25th episode. And so this might be something special, is what I'm expecting. And number two is I want to talk about the fact that we're having this conversation, I think is a testament to the power of putting yourself out there into different communities, being spontaneous, attending different events and conferences in the city you're in. And so how I actually met Daniel was very last minute, signed up for an event on friendship, which was a weekend long, Saturday and Sunday. Thought I would attend only Saturday because Sunday was supposed to be my work day. Went to the event, ended up enjoying it a lot, and then immediately canceled my Sunday plans and ended up going on Sunday as well. You're actually the only one I got a chance to exchange contact info with on that event. And so I'm only in touch with you. And so this is where we are here today. And so I've been speaking so much about the power of networking, building connections at university. You never know what will be helpful later on. Someone in the episode very nicely said that connections need to be built before, not after, or during a moment of need. They need to be it needs to be like a stash or a reserve which you have, so that when you need it, you sort of have people to reach out to. And so, yeah, I think just a physical embodiment of that. So that was my quick spiel. We'll now turn it over to you. But so you're an alumni. You graduated in 2021, so it's been about 3 years. And would love to begin by just catching up the audience on these last 3 years. And what are you sort of currently working on?
For sure. So I guess over the last few years, I've gone through a couple different phases. I studied computer science. At first, I was working at Box, which is a relatively large cloud software company, similar to Dropbox, more enterprise-oriented. I left that to join a startup, and that's a whole story, but I was at the startup for exactly 2 weeks before I left that also. It was a really very challenging experience. After I left the startup that I was at for 2 weeks, there was a period where I went to an organization called Recurse Center, which is a learning retreat for programmers that's very focused on the joy of coding. That would be a very interesting thing to talk about in the context of college and all this educational stuff, because that was a very, very, very positive educational experience in a non-college environment. But maybe we can put a pin in that for a second. When I was there, I had the opportunity to build a website called Methodable, that was possibly going to become a startup. That was one of my personal projects. Then I started working on my own company with a friend. While I was doing that, I got into independent contracting / consulting as a software engineer and picked up a couple clients doing that. And now I'm full-time working with these two different clients on AI projects. So that's at least career-wise what I've been doing since graduation. And I've also been kind of bouncing around and living in different places. A lot of time in the Bay Area, and then right now I'm in Denver for the summer. That's where I'm at.
The beauty of remote work, I think, is like being in these different places and having that flexibility. And I feel like a lot of high schoolers listening to this episode, my big assumption is that a huge percentage of them will be doing remote work. And so I think that's also a totally different mindset versus going to the office every day, and physically, let's say, networking and being with people versus being in the comfort of your home and sort of doing the remote work. So that is a prediction I have. But since you mentioned the joy of coding, I'm hearing it for the first time. I'm sure it's a useful resource, especially for people listening to this episode into programming and software engineering. So say a little more about that experience.
Yeah, so it's this organization called the Recurse Center, and they're headquartered in Brooklyn in New York. When I did it, it was during COVID, and so it was all online. I was actually living in Boulder at that point. But it's a really cool institute. It is completely free, and they take people of all different skill levels. So it's not like a boot camp that is supposed to take you from a particular place to another particular place. It is for people all across their careers. Like a lot of like very seasoned veterans of the software industry will go there, but there will also be people who are like just getting into coding, or maybe they're coming from a different industry. So it's a very diverse group of people, and the entire setup is organized by the community who is participating. And so there's not a curriculum, it's just people and a calendar, and you put stuff on the calendar and you say, I'm really curious about databases and how do you build a database from scratch, and I'm going to create a reading group or something that will meet every week at this time, and we're going to learn about this together. And it's just this whole group of people learning about things together and reading papers, building projects. Obviously, it's very hands-on, and it's all self-guided, and it's very cool. And there are all these principles about how people are very collaborative and things like that. So just like a very supportive community, and there's this big focus on not being career oriented. They do career services, which are helpful if you want a job after doing the thing, which happens to be how they fund themselves as well, but they're optional. And while you're there, you're really encouraged to like reconnect with the joy of the thing. Yeah, so it's a very cool organization, and I learned a ton there and also enjoyed programming a lot. So it worked for me. And also has been a very sweet community to be a part of. They have a whole like extended network of people. Like as I became a contractor, there's a lot of people there who do software contracting, and I've got to stay in touch with them and can get their advice on like how to get clients, how to handle contracts and negotiations and all of that. That's just one example, but for many different interest groups, it's also a really great place for meeting people.
Speaking about the joy of coding, the joy of programming, and just learning for the sake of it, I know both types of people, honestly. I know people who love programming and love software engineering, and sort of this is what they'll do if you give them a whole Sunday. It's like they would be happy to code on their computers all day. Plus, I also know quite a few people who sort of just get into it because that is the buzz and this is the new thing. They don't really enjoy it, but they sort of feel that they develop a passion along the way. So I know both sides of people. Speaking to both these groups, from your perspective, since we spent this last section on the joy of coding, what is it you personally love about software engineering and working with like AI and machine learning?
Yeah, I think it's a very artistic thing. I think that there are different parts of coding and some parts that I like and some parts that I don't like as much. A lot of people devoting into like, there's like the plumbing aspects where you're just like figuring out how to get data from point A to point B to point C, etc. And then there's like the algorithm design part. I really like algorithms. And I actually remember this conversation that I had with a professor around the time that I was graduating. And I had expressed that I was really interested in design and algorithms and things like that. I actually had this conversation with a few people and got a response that like it's not really easy to get that in the industry. Like you're not going to get to work on these fun kind of algorithms challenges. And I actually think they were wrong. I think over my transition through the years, I kind of ended up getting that sort of more creative work that's really exciting to me. And that required both, I think, going more in the startup direction where you just have more ability to build new systems. Like I really like building new systems that are like entirely my own code. That's super fun to me. It gets to be like, you know, my own little project. For me personally, less fun to work with other people's code. It's like I have to like squeeze my brain into like the shape of their brain. It's kind of like less comfortable than like living in my own world. So moving towards startups, working on my own projects has been super enjoyable. And also just for me, like working with abstract ideas is really fun. So moving in more abstract directions, like with this project that I was working on for a while called Methodible, it was like a kind of note-taking system that has a language embedded in it that makes your notes into a routine that can like prompt you through stuff.
Wow.
That kind of thing, it's like there's a lot of challenges there, a lot of design and stuff like that. So that stuff I find very fun.
And would you say that the mindset with which you are approaching programming is similar to most other programmers you know or in your circle, in terms of most of them not enjoying this plumbing aspect of data from point A to point B to point C, enjoying the abstractness or the artisticness, the design, or is that more unique to just you?
I think a lot of people would have a similar set of interests. I think there was some survey talking about programmers' least favorite things, and it was like legacy code is the big one. So like people, like a lot of big tech companies, you have to work with these old code bases that are really large and slow and difficult to understand, and it's layers upon layers of different coders, generations of things. And like I have a friend who works in the industry at a large company who I was talking to recently who described his job as like 95% reading other people's code and making like tiny changes to make sure that stuff doesn't break, and like maybe 5% actually writing code.
Wow.
And I would believe that there's ways to make that enjoyable. Like I think you can, if you can turn anything into a challenge that you can get better at, I think there are ways to make it enjoyable. But yeah, definitely for me personally, I like working on new things where it feels like a creative process. And I think that's relatively common. But it could also be that I surround myself with people who have similar interests.
No, I mean that's interesting to know. I feel like a lot of high schoolers at that stage are still sort of figuring out what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy in terms of passions and subjects within a subject, like let's say coding, what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy. I feel like having clarity on that as early as possible before university, ideally not possible for many people during university, also allows you to focus in on certain aspects of a subject that you enjoy more and leave aside certain aspects. Like when I do economics, I'm less interested in the math side of it just because I'm a little sort of not great with working with and fundamentally understanding numbers, or sort of they don't glimmer in front of my eyes on a spreadsheet. But I love working on the qualitative aspect. I love getting like developmental economics, and getting into theories and models. And so I'm aware of that. I'm shaping my sort of degree to focus on those interests and minimize sort of what I enjoy less about the subject. So yeah, would you say, I know that in your case you began working for a company, then you went into a startup, and then the personal projects led to sort of freelance. But for someone who is clear, hypothetically, from day one of university, there's sort of two different paths here, which is, one is like your friend, they're aware they want to be an employee in a big tech company, and part two is someone who's very aware that I want to either start something of my own or I want to get into freelance. Do you feel like for person A and person B, the paths through university are different, or like what they're optimizing for at university is different?
I think overall, there's a similar set of skills that are useful at a larger or smaller company. I think that it is very important, whatever you want to do, to get experience doing that thing. So if you want to work at big companies, it's super useful to get an internship working at a big company. If you want to work at startups, it's super useful to work at a startup. I think either way, it's super useful to work on your own projects. In terms of actual time spent at university, I feel like those are really the main things. I think networking and meeting people, and then also working on projects, and on both of those sides, doing it just in an area that excites you, whether that's a particular field, if it's like a project that you think would be cool if it existed in the world, if it's a category of companies, like we were talking about, large or small companies, even for anything, I think meeting people and working on projects and getting experiences is like by far the most important thing, like more important than classes and anything like that. And I guess I did some of that in college. I spent a lot of time with classes, so I don't know if I necessarily recommend that. But yeah, I think yeah, meeting people and working on projects and like exploring in an open-ended way, I think is important. I think it's hard for people to know what the right thing to do is, what the right direction to go is.
And so you're saying building projects and getting experience in that field, number one, and number two, networking, also with people who are doing things which you see yourself doing in the future. That's sort of a great combination to get clarity as to what's your path after graduation. You think I sort of summarized that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
And I mean, I remember, this sort of stuck in my mind when we were sort of talking before this recording. You told me sort of about how you wish you hadn't been the valedictorian, and so just that signal was like the fact what was sort of a signal that you had spent way too much time in class. And so, I mean, especially for someone listening who's into especially computer science, you want to be in somewhere like the Bay Area, get into tech. You don't want to be like you're clear about, at least not for the moment, pursuing further education. I would say I totally agree. Like, don't be the valedictorian. Spend less time in class. Optimize for meeting people on one end, and optimize for like building cool projects on the other. And that will also make what you're learning in class more relevant versus that just being like a theoretical bubble, which I find many people get into like at university. And sort of then when they get out, it's like, how do I apply this particular concept into the work I'm doing? So yeah.
I would say that a podcast like this is also a very cool kind of project, or a blog or anything like that. Like a project, even if you're in computer science, doesn't have to be necessarily code related. There's lots of different things.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a good add-on. I always have found I am a content creator, so I love sort of putting content out there, writing and podcasting. But even for someone like yourself, someone technical in a very different field, I always feel like content creation is very high leverage as an activity because it's sort of putting yourself out there. And so tomorrow, when someone like let's say when I googled your name, I found your personal website and I saw sort of your art. I saw your photography, I saw some of your writing work. And so that gives me an idea of who you are beyond the resume, which you're going to be like sending me in the case that I'm a potential employer. So I always feel like content is high leverage, sort of builds that personal brand, which is another term that's sort of revolving around nowadays. So yeah, that's a good add-on. Um, if you were to summarize the 4 year WashU experience in like 2 or 3 sentences, how was that entire experience for you?
Yes, this is a difficult one for me. And overall, it was very good, but I feel like my memories of my time were. I mean, I'm a very like routine person, so I kind of had my routines. But I studied a lot. I learned some things. I played ultimate frisbee. I went on runs. I went to the gym. I read books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that was already like I already used up my 3 sentences, I think.
No, I mean those are all commas, so you're good. uh, you mentioned the big one of the big regrets being sort of being the valedictorian, spending a lot of time in the classroom versus outside the classroom. Um, why I love talking to alumni is that you can share these regrets or these mistakes, some missed opportunities at university, looking back. So like now that you're 3 years in, you sort of can look at this in reflection and sort of have a higher eagle view, which is why I love having alumni talk to the high schoolers because then they can be like aware of these common mistakes even before entering. And so I would love to further push you on this. We've talked about sort of spending too much time in the classroom. Apart from that, any other regrets or big mistakes, missed opportunities at WashU?
Yeah, so definitely spending a lot of time on the classes is a big one. Um, and I think with that, I still had a pretty healthy relationship with it. It's just very easy for me to, like, when I'm given homework, I just assume, like, oh, I should do a good job at this because it was assigned to me. And I don't know if that's wrong of me, but what ends up happening is that I would just spend a lot of time on that. And that kind of becomes the main thing that I'm doing throughout my experience. So I feel like if I could go back, I would try to be more intentional about shaking that up, maybe about taking on extra responsibilities outside of my work in classes in some way that would help me take my time away from that. Like I think the big things that I would love to have focused on more is meeting people. Like networking is one way to say that, but that sounds very like professional, and that's not what I think is the important thing. Like I think connecting with people is super important. When you go to college, you are in this really awesome environment where you suddenly have all these great people around you and all this free time and a lot of opportunities to make friendships and connections and everything like that. And I did make some really great friendships in college. And like looking back on it, those are the most important parts.
Yeah.
And obviously there's all this like hindsight bias with like, well, yes, I did do all these things in college that were like looked very good on a resume. So like I do have to admit that those things were beneficial. But yeah, I would, if I could go back and refocus things, I think focusing more on people, including dating. I think dating in college is great. I didn't do too much of that. Yeah, and at least for me personally, I think it's easier to think about things to focus more energy on rather than things to focus less energy on. So that might be how I would phrase that.
Yeah. Mm. Nice. The dating sort of brought a smile to my face. When I left, I told my parents, and I sort of told myself mentally that 4 years for me is heads down, focused on work, not gonna get into sort of the complications of dating. But maybe this is something I give a think after this episode. Maybe this has put a smile on other high schoolers as well. So yeah, I mean, I love the more personal side of that answer as to focusing on things like connections and projects, but also you're only in college once, and so do those wild things which sort of people only do in college, and all those whatever parties and dating and traveling are all, I think, like part of that college experience, very overlooked when people are more heads down and focused on like building a career, which is also super important, of course. Um, Especially having known you for very limited time. This is sort of the observation that I made. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Is that in terms of personality, you seem more introverted, slightly reserved, someone who takes their time to open up and sort of have a conversation. Would you agree with the description overall?
I think so.
Okay. So specifically, this is why I'm excited to ask you this next question, because I'm sure there are so many listeners like you listening to this episode. Um, thrown into a new environment, especially as someone like yourself, how did you go about actually connecting with people, building that close friendship group? And I'm sure it might have like taken slightly more time versus someone who's immediately very outgoing and excited about something like this. But what did like connecting with people and friendships and social life look like for you at WashU?
So one of my core friend groups came about pretty quickly from my dorm, from people who lived in the same suite as me and some other people in the same building. Um, and so that was pretty lucky. And then I think there was a long period. So I guess in terms of like social groups and things, I played ultimate frisbee. I and made a lot of my friends through the frisbee team. That was mostly it for a while. And I also felt largely like there were a lot of people on the frisbee team who were fun to be around, but weren't like super close, like existential existential connections to me. So I actually, in terms of like really close friends, that took a lot of time, and I didn't really have a particular strategy. I had actually two of my closest friends came about very late into my college experience, pretty randomly. One guy who used to be on the frisbee team, and we ended up in a computer science class together, and then ended up working on this quasi startup thing over the junior year summer, and then we became super, super close. Another friend who I'm living with right now, we met senior year, but still were able to become really close. So maybe that's the cool thing, like even towards the tail end of college, I was able to develop some really great friendships. Yeah, I mean, I think, and actually after college, I feel like my strategies got better. After college, I started really targeting more groups that were things that I was interested in, like blogs that I read. I would go to meetups for that. I would try to meet friends of friends who have similar interests in things like AI and programming languages and I don't know, whatever other stuff I'm interested in. Yeah, I think like putting yourself out there. I guess I'm in like general life advice mode right now. Like things I could have done better, perhaps, but yeah, finding groups of people based on shared interests. I think for me in particular, like intellectual interests, turned out to be pretty important. But also rock climbing was a big thing. So I don't know.
Yeah. Mm. Common interests, common passions, niche obsessions. It's how you bond with people, and how what brings that first conversation, which is also why I think before being in college, so valuable to invest in hobbies and passions, because that makes you a more well-rounded person versus someone who's like academically great, which I'm sure is almost like a prerequisite for anyone going to like a top school. Two things I'll add here from sort of personal experience over just 1 year of college is number one, I think a very valuable aspect of college is solo time. And so prior to college, I lived at home all the time. So I was always surrounded by the other five members of my family. At college, I did a lot of solo travel. I would eat meals alone at times. I would go to a conference alone if other friends weren't interested. Spending that time with yourself, learning to like enjoy your own company, do things that interest you, even if they don't interest your friends. Solo travel is sort of also because this time in your life is sort of you're shaping your identity, you're sort of thinking deeply about what you're passionate about, what do you believe about the world at large. I feel like that sort of time really helped me with a lot of thinking about a lot of like deep questions. Plus, number two is I feel like a common myth, which is illogical, but even I entered college and thinking this is that first few weeks is sort of that period when the close friendships form, and from then on, it's sort of these groups which don't really change, and that pretty much continues on for the other 3.5 years. I feel like I found my close group probably towards the fag end of the first year, when we just had about 2 months, a month to go, is when I feel like I found that close group. And it's very dynamic. Like things change, people change over college, and so I have a lot of people who meet like close friends second year, third year of college. So always being open, I guess, to new connections, not sticking with that same five, six people who you love hanging out with, putting yourself out there, as you said. Even I'm getting into life advice mode. But yeah, I feel like very, very valuable. And everyone's experience is different. Embracing it if your experience is different. If you go to the first semester still not having found your close group, sort of having faith that it'll come, it'll come. We've got 3.5 years to go. So yeah. Um, Want to transition to computer science classes, and sort of as an alumni, someone who's working in the field, I want to very honestly ask you, how much did what you learn in the classroom in school actually apply to being useful in terms of the work you're doing now? And on a higher level, especially for like a computer science degree, do you feel like it's even worth it to go to college?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the classes were a little bit useful. I remember there was one alumnus who came back to WashU from the Frisbee team who had studied computer science. Actually, I think a couple of people have said this. Like, there was one class at WashU that was like the one useful class, and it's called Rapid Prototyping and Creative Development. And it's a class in which you do a series of web development projects, and each of them is using a different stack, and you're building these web applications from scratch. And it's like you're building actual applications, and some of them towards the end are more creative and you design your own thing. And I do think that class also is pretty helpful. But yeah, a lot of classes are, I mean, I think compared to what you learn in the field, like very not helpful. And there is a great essay about this kind of thing by a guy named Simon Saris about knowledge being very specific and very context dependent. And basically, in college, you're learning a very generic set of tools, but then you go into your first job and it's like, okay, I'm using a language I've never written in before. I'm doing back-end development on a large code base. Like, none of this is stuff that happened in college. I think what you do get in the computer science department is there are some broad skills of just understanding how coding works, understanding how programming languages work that are pretty transferable. There are a lot of skills that are like how to actually build software in a production environment, or how to actually build something people can use. And those generally don't get taught so much, at least in my experience. There's a lot more theoretical things and so on. So I feel like, but I don't even want to attribute that to WashU, because I think that it is very challenging to say, we're going to take 4 years of your life and teach you this stuff that you're going to then use, versus I think it's just the sooner you can be connected to the actual work you're doing, it's just so much more valuable to learn in that context. And so like my feeling is that right after I graduated, and this is kind of true with everything, with like meeting people, with my knowledge of software engineering, like it all totally sped up right when I was suddenly like in the world and had all these choices to make and had like a real job and all of that. And in computer science, there is this thing where there are boot camps or you can teach yourself. There are a lot of meritocratic organizations that will hire people who don't have college degrees. And I had mentioned this to you earlier, but there are some people who give the advice of you should apply to colleges, get into one, then immediately drop out just to show that you could get in because it's all a signaling game. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I mean, I think college has a lot of benefits, so I'm not going to tell people to drop out. I think it's useful to think about it as not a completely necessary thing. Like, I think it's a healthy mindset to understand. Like, I would say you can do totally fine without a college degree in the world of software engineering if you're good at it. And even if you go to college, that's still good to know. And I think also just it's good to know that most of the learning is going to happen once you are in a real environment with real responsibilities. And I think that's just generally true across all jobs and all different disciplines.
But yeah, I mean, I would even add on and say that I know this is true for a lot of universities from what I'm hearing from friends, is that certain classes are much more theoretical. And so there's ton of value in that if that is what you're into. But I would say, especially if you're interested in like getting into the world of work after college, in building and like building a startup, I would say there are certain classes which are also very project based. And so like there might be a finance class where the whole class is just sort of investing in stocks and then coming to class, discussing, taking feedback. Or in your case, I don't know too well about a computer science degree, but I'm sure there might be certain classes which are more focused on building projects, writing code, getting feedback from professors. And I would say like consider those classes to be very important as well, alongside the theoretical classes, which are sometimes just prerequisites and mandatory. Do you think you'd agree with that?
I'd agree. I'd also say at WashU, so the one class I've mentioned so far is rapid prototyping and creative development. I also took Introduction to Entrepreneurship. That was also a pretty hands-on class that I learned a lot in, I think, like actual transferable skills. There's another class that I didn't take, but is in a similar vein called the Hatchery, where students actually try to start a company, and there have been companies that start out of that class. So that's super cool. And yeah, I think it's a good point for you to bring up, like there's the whole academic routes where the more theoretical classes might be more valuable. I think even in those cases, you might be able to think about what output you want to have as an academic and still try to end up in a situation where you can have that output as quickly as possible. Like maybe you want to discover something new, you want to write a paper that helps synthesize different ideas. So even then, I think being in that context early on is also just super helpful to learning.
Yeah, very true. I'm enjoying sort of the back and forth going on. Before we dive into some more specifics, which I'm very curious to hear from you about regarding the 4-year experience at WashU, I want to actually rewind a little bit chronologically, and I want to get to your high school days as like high school Daniel, interested in computer science, working on his university applications. I'm sure it's been a while, but we can also talk to this at a more high level as to, I would love to hear from you how you approached the application from a more strategic and a tactical point of view. Plus, I'm sure we all make mistakes along the way. We've all done things wrong. And so if you're comfortable talking about that, I would love to dive deep into that as well.
Actually, WashU was the only school that I got into. Maybe like 6 to 8 that I applied to. Maybe like 8. And that was surprising to me. So, but I don't know why that happened to in particular. I do feel like looking back and based on some conversations I had with people, I had some friends who did more research and spoke to advisors and things like that and had like a strategy with their application. I don't think I really had a strategy. And I think based on, and I'm totally not the person to ask about what is the current way to fill out a college application. I don't know. But I do have a kind of cynical view about that in particular, which is, like, I think when I was filling it out, I was really trying to create just an accurate representation of myself or something like that. And that's probably not the move. Like, the move is probably to understand the system that you are trying to operate in and do the things that the system wants you to do. And that's like the opposite of the advice that I would give for most other parts of life, including like while you're in college. My advice is to like, don't do what the system wants you to do and like do your own thing, right? And figure out what you love and what gives you energy and et cetera, et cetera. But maybe for the application itself, which is this like weird process, like it's a weird thing. It's like a bunch of people sitting in a room deciding who's gonna get into your school. Like, I don't know. I would say like try to take yourself out of it a little bit maybe, and like don't be too worried about tying your identity to this thing. Obviously it's a hard thing to do because it feels like people might be judging you, but that might be like, if I could go back, I would try to treat it a bit more tactically or something. And but I don't know, I mean, who knows what I'd do differently. Obviously I still got into a good school, but it was surprising that I just got into the one.
You mentioned that this was a slightly cynical worldview. But if I were to slightly extrapolate, I think the comforting aspect of this is that when you don't tie your identity to the application, it's also, the way I look at it is they're rejecting the application, they're not rejecting you. And so it's sort of not rejecting you as a person or in terms of your identity. You put down certain extracurriculars, you wrote certain essays, you had certain grades. That's what they're rejecting. They're not rejecting you as a person deemed unfit to be at XYZ institution. Your application was like unfit to be at XYZ institution. That could be for whatever reason. That could be like a lack of knowledge and research. That could be a partly luck. That could be not being a good fit to the university. There could be like 100 different factors in that. But yeah, so I think there's both a cynical and a comforting side to this. But that was also a great way to wrap up the first section. We're going to now fast forward. So we've left like high school Daniel behind, and then we're fast forwarding a little bit, still in the past. We're going to talk about like college Daniel and a few of, I want to dive into some specifics of how you spent your time over the 4 years. And probably the first thing I'd love to start with is that we have, for us in the US, if we're doing the 4 years, we've got 3 university summers. And so I'm sure each of the summers looks different in its own way. But also it's sort of a very interesting time where you can like completely slack off and disconnect and take a break. You can be working harder than at university. Like I've had people have all the range of summers. So let's start with just giving a brief overview of how you spent each of these 3 summers at WashU.
So each summer had a different internship and also some other project of some sort. The first summer I worked at a startup called Crypto Move, which was not cryptocurrency related. It was named that before the whole cryptocurrency boom, cryptography related. And I was working on a C++ memory management system and trying to find bugs with it. That was pretty fun. And I was also working on recording some of my piano music, which you can find on danielsosebee.com/music. And I'm very happy about that project. That was like a whole chunk where I was spending almost all my time, like I'd bike to the internship, bike back, record the music. But that was a really great project. And since it was a short internship, I also got to travel and went to Ecuador with my older brother for 5 weeks, and we were backpacking around the country.
Okay.
And that was also super fun. So that's summer number one. Summer number one was very good. Pretty hard to beat. The second summer, I worked at Amazon, and that was in San Francisco, which was great because I could still live at home and commute into the city. I grew up in Oakland. And I was also doing a Spanish small group class because I was preparing to go to Spain, which maybe we'll talk about soon, to study abroad, which was also really awesome. There was this like very good, very intense teacher who was pretty much all in Spanish. I had learned a bit in lower school and middle school, and then none in high school. So I was trying to get it back. But that's how that summer was. And then I interned at Box, which is the company that I returned to after graduating during my third summer. And at the time, I was also working on this startup with my friend Ollie, which was it went through a bunch of different phases. The original idea was we were going to create a consultancy where we hire WashU students as engineers to build things for other companies. So we were talking to all these different companies in St. Louis that needed websites or different things. We interviewed like 20 or 30 CS students, and we actually had this whole like interview pipeline that was really interesting. We had a lot of processes. Pretty much nothing actually got done, partially because it was COVID and the whole world kind of shut down, but also I think we were a little bit excited about the processes. That's kind of like a theme with me. And actually take on too many real projects. Although that did turn into, through that whole startup thing, I got introduced to someone who got me another opportunity that ended up being an internship during my first semester of senior year, which was during COVID. And at that point, I actually dropped out for a semester and took 2 classes online at Arizona State University while I did this internship. So that was not a summer, but I thought I'd mention that as well. Anyways, those were my 3 summers.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. And maybe this next question is more interesting towards someone who's currently a freshman in university or a sophomore in university. Fortunately, unfortunately, a lot of us don't end up getting internships over the summer. That was my case. I sort of just headed back home, spent a few days sort of chilling and relaxing, and then decided that this was not how I wanted to spend the whole summer, just sort of lying in bed. And so that's actually where I sort of began thinking, and this beautiful podcast project came out. And in fact, this is probably better than most internships I might have potentially done over my first year summer. So in terms of specifically, like, you've also been building interesting projects through university and through the summer. For someone who's just not sure where to start, like they've got 3 or 4 months, they have time on their hands, they want to be building something cool, don't quite know what they want to build. How do they sort of get started? Like where does the inspiration or the idea come from?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because I feel like inspiration could come from so many different places for so many different people. I suppose for my own projects, I was able to find ways to build software related to things I was already interested in. So like these whole journaling and reflection systems, I was able to think about what software would I want to help me follow these routines or to help me keep track of my notes or that kind of thing. So that's one interesting thought experiment, I guess, is things already existing interests in your life that could somehow merge with the career interests. I feel like this gets into maybe like designing your life territory. Like this is a book that I recommend from some, whatever, it doesn't matter who it's from. It's a great book about treating your life as a design problem. It has all this great brainstorming activities where you can have a kind of system for specifying different interests and using those to make different combinations and think about different pathways that might be interesting. So if you don't know what to do, you could read that book. But then, yeah, I think for computer science in particular, like there's so many great projects out there. Like making a personal website, I think, is one really great way to do that. There's a lot of benefits to that as well. Just it's like a place that you can express yourself. You can use it professionally. It's also like a relatively simple project to get started with. Games are fun to make. Yeah, those are some thoughts. Also, like using your network, like even if you don't have an internship, I think there's still, even if you don't have an internship at the beginning of the summer, there's still possibly other opportunities to connect with people either who have existing projects or just connect with people who have ideas for projects. Maybe there are people who work in industry that could give you advice on what are big problems that they're working on or that kind of thing. Those are some thoughts.
No, those are great thoughts. I love sort of just in my observation. I love sort of the way you sort of answer the questions more in a more free flowing way, and sort of it's just thought one, thought two, thought three, thought four versus like something that's super structured and scripted. But yeah, I mean, throwing different suggestions out there. You threw out suggestions for people who have defined interests. You threw out designing your life for someone who's totally unsure. I personally also recommend the book. Read it sort of final year of high school, gave me a bit of clarity about sort of how I want to shape my university journey as well. And yeah, in fact, third thing you spoke about is personal website, which I really would love to deep dive on. I'm in fact very sort of pleasantly surprised that this is the first episode of the 25 where someone has brought up a personal website. So crucial, so valuable. As I said, personal brand, content creation, tying all of that together. And so there's two sort of angles at which I want to approach a personal website. The first is if you could sort of talk about the purpose and intention of building a personal website on a more macro level, or you can talk through what it was for you specifically. And number two, what's the process? Like maybe this is difficult for people to start imagining as to what do they include, how do they build it? So what was your sort of process for building this?
Cool. So starting with the intention, my intention with the personal site was always to try to express myself and to try to understand myself, I think, and to try to put out there, like I have a lot of different interests. It can be hard to keep track of them. I get a lot of joy out of trying to fit them into some kind of structure. So that's one part of it. But recently I've been very motivated by trying to just put things about myself on the internet such that other people can find them and understand things about me and connect with me. Like on my personal website, the first thing that you see is all the different ways to contact me. I'm not sure if it's there anymore, but I used to have a sentence that was like, I'd really love to hear from you, because that is the main thing that I hope to get out of it, is to connect with like-minded people, to make new friends, new collaborators, whatever. So I think that's the big motivation. And in terms of the process, my first site was built using Notion. That's a super good way to do it. There's a few different tools where you can connect a Notion, I don't know what you call it, but like a folder or like database or whatever, and it'll turn it into a website for you. And so I think that's super great. Once I got more into coding, I was pretty interested in building something more custom. There's a period where I had a very custom personal website, and it was a little bit hard to navigate. And so now I've landed somewhere in the middle where I'm using a template, but it's still like a code base where I'm writing markdown files, and it's like, you know, managed in my own Git repository. And that's nice because I get full control of the CSS and stuff, so I can add whatever styles and move images around however I want. I actually used a documentation site theme, so it's not meant to be a personal website or a blog or whatever. It's meant to be like a website for documenting a product or a code base or something. But because of that, it has lots of nice features with like a very rich sidebar and like left and right buttons for going between pages, which I enjoy. And so also, I guess on my site, there's a few different, if you get into making personal sites, there's like all these different philosophies of how to build them. There's this term digital garden, which I highly recommend people Google. There's some cool stuff with that. A digital garden is more like a Wikipedia where you have like pages that are constantly being updated, versus a blog is also basically a personal site. A blog is more like you publish something and then it's just there. And I think each of those has different benefits. Like the digital garden style thing is nice because you can just slowly update stuff in the background. It doesn't feel super high stakes. Blogs are nice because when you publish something, it's just done. You can also set up email lists, and then you have like, you know, the whole content creation thing going on. I think for me and for other people, you have to find a bit of a balance between how comfortable are you sending things out to people. Like partially I created my personal site because I wanted to put stuff up that didn't immediately get blasted out to all my email followers. So that's also part of the balance.
Okay. Just for the benefit of listeners for whom maybe this is like the first time they even coming across the concept, to sort of get into the weeds of this and micro details, and I'll ask you to add to this list if I've missed anything. Stuff to include on a personal website could be blogs you've written, any sort of art, so like photography, any sort of other art. I feel like that's a great way to express yourself. Any cool projects you've built, and if you can put links, like if you can put links to like articles, videos, code bases, that's all very valuable to sort of projects, accomplishments, contact info. I love doing sort of a quick personal description, 2, 3 paragraphs. Who am I? Where am I going? What's my sort of mission statement? Interesting hobbies and passions for potential connections. Apart from these 5, do you feel like you would add anything to the list?
That seems like a good list.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, everyone's is so different. I feel like go ahead, check out Daniel's personal website. I've got a personal website. Ask friends, ask mentors for their personal website. Go through like 10, 15. You'll also start getting an idea as to like what you like, what you don't like, the direction yours is shaping in. Always helpful for me to sort of like just have a piece of paper, get a pen, and do a very basic wireframe. And then that sort of gives me an idea. I'm not sort of programming my personal website. I'm just using basic online tools. But for however technical you want to get with it, I feel like the wireframe is a broad overview. You sort of foreshadowed this, which is also something difficult about hosting, is that many times my guests foreshadow the next question, and so it sort of ruins the suspense. But it's a challenge I'm sort of working with. The semester in Madrid, which was a pleasant surprise to me as to also studying there, versus I know people who have gone to like UK and other parts of Europe, but it's the first time I'm hearing of someone spending a sem in Spain. And so I'm sure there's an interesting story or two here, but I'm just going to ask you about the overall experience and the value of that experience.
Yeah, so I had a very interesting experience in Madrid. I was very intent on integrating into the culture in spending all of my time with Spanish people and not with Americans, and with getting really good at Spanish. And this was overall not the goals of the other people in my program. So there was one other girl who also seemed pretty interested in hanging out with Spanish students. Other than that, it was like all Americans living in apartments, partying, and like flying to Greece and whatever. That was not what I was about. I was very intent on like getting good at this language, exposing myself to a new culture. And that was a challenge for me because I wasn't that good at Spanish. But I really tried to do that, and I'm happy that I did. There was one kind of big story that happened over my experience, which is that, so I chose to live in a dormitory. That was one of the options on my program. And in the dormitories in Spain, there's this thing called the novatada, and it's basically like hazing it's kind of like a fraternity for the entire dormitory. And the way the dorms work is they're not associated with a particular university. So it's like students from all these different universities, and the novatada system is not gender specific. It's like the entire dorm. If you're new there, you get hazed, or you opt out of it. But if you opt out of it, you don't get to be friends with the 70% of people who participate in this. You don't get to sit with them, anything like that. All the Americans, and there were 10 of us in the dorm, were not into the system. It wasn't even like worth it because we were there for like a semester. So we didn't do it. And because of that, these people didn't want to be friends with us. And I thought that was wrong. So I ended up with this quest basically to prove these people wrong and convince them to hang out with us, even though we weren't doing their system. And to do this, I had to like get good at Spanish and like network through their like hierarchy to find like their leaders to try to convince them that like, hey, we're doing this cultural exchange thing. You're being super lame by ignoring this opportunity. You should hang out with us. And it was this like huge challenge that was like taking over my whole like experience there. And I wasn't even that successful in the end. I was like a little bit successful, but they were very obstinate. But anyways, that was the big thing.
Yeah.
So a pretty unique experience, perhaps. I think the big thing is like, I'm very happy that I didn't just like party and fly around. I'm very happy that I like tried to integrate with people and also had this big challenge that I was working on, even though it was a pretty random challenge. But those are the main points of my study abroad experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a saying I love, which is have less things to show and more stories to tell. And study abroad will always give you more stories to tell versus spending that semester at your university, which I'm sure is like more comfortable in some sense. Maybe you can focus more on the academics. But I always encourage people to take that one semester, go study abroad, have that experience, have stories to tell. You brought up two interesting points. I'm sure there's more to the list here. And this is not even for study abroad. It's even for someone, an international student, just going into another country and wanting to sort of get to know the place beyond just the campus. So in terms of integrating with the culture and with the city, you spoke about first is learning the language, and second thing you said is interacting with locals. What else is there on that list?
I found it helpful. So another thing I did is I joined an ultimate frisbee club. That was helpful, like extracurriculars or having that structure is good. We had a dining hall at the dormitory, and so I would just always sit down with the locals. And there was actually, it wasn't all Spanish people. There were also some Dominican people that I became friends with. But that would also be a challenge. It's like a big challenge walking into the dining hall. There's all these different people you could sit down with. It can be a little bit like nerve-wracking, but that was also something that I just did every time. I think being able to have those routines, that's like every day I'm going to do this, whether it's, eating food with people, doing some other activity. For me, I think those were very important. And I think also while meeting people, just trying to create opportunities for other interactions, like trying to make plans outside of the dormitory, going out some night with Spanish students, for example. I found people were very friendly. Not the people who didn't want to hang out with us, they were not friendly, but there were people who were very friendly. The people who were friendly were very friendly. And I think especially if you're from a different place and getting used to the language, people are very accommodating and want to help you make friends and help you language and everything.
Yeah, find those people who are like, find the locals who are so interested in like taking you to their favorite restaurant, helping you with the language, sort of holding your hand along the way. I'm sure you'll find people like that at any study abroad experience. Find those people, ignore the rest, ignore that 70% who sort of were less friendly in your case, because it's always a choice of what you can focus upon. I would rather invest in the 30% and build deeper connections versus try and be like pleasant acquaintances with the other 70%. So yeah. Lastly, before we sort of begin wrapping up this conversation and moving to the final sections, would love to touch upon a few classes, interesting classes you took outside of your major, which was computer science. And so you actually were pursuing two minors parallelly, one in electrical engineering, the other in entrepreneurship. And those, from our previous conversations, those seem to be very valuable, even alongside the computer science heavy classes. What was the value of those extra classes you took?
Yeah, so I first picked up those minors. Well, actually, originally I was undecided in my whole major thing. And when I ended up selecting computer science, I also chose this electrical engineering and entrepreneurship minor with the thought that I was really into music and I could do some music technology thing with those three. And then that didn't end up happening. But anyways, they still had a lot of fun classes. Electrical engineering had a lot of like fun, hard math classes. I don't know if any of them are particularly noteworthy, but some of the entrepreneurship ones were, I mean, I guess on that topic, one thing I'll note is depending on what kind of person you are, college is a cool experience to take classes in fun theoretical things that you wouldn't have the time to learn at other times. Like I'm just saying that because earlier I was talking so highly of like the value of the realistic projects and all of that. So I guess this is like a caveat, which is if you are able to like actually enjoy the fun theoretical stuff, that's also, I think, great. I mean, I love theoretical stuff myself. And I got a lot of that from electrical engineering, which had all this math that you don't get in computer science. But yeah, entrepreneurship I had a few different business school classes. There's actually this guy, Michael McLaughlin, who's a professor of accounting, who sadly left WashU. He's like the best professor I've ever had. He is one of the best people I've ever interacted with. He runs this website called Edspira, which is the same kind of thing as Khan Academy, but for financial accounting and business strategy and things like that. So there's like a certified accountant course that usually costs like $10,000 or whatever, and he gives all the stuff away to people for free. He's like super, super selfless, just like an amazing person. So taking a class with him was really awesome. I guess that's another cool thing about college. You might end up with professors who are really great people like that. I feel like that's also not something I thought about so much. But if you have those opportunities to have a professor who is an inspiring person, that's super awesome. Yeah. One other class I'll mention is Introduction to Entrepreneurship, which was a really great class for me at WashU. One of the more challenging ones because, and that's for me personally, there's one part of the class that I remember where we were giving pitches. So throughout the class, we pitched different ideas. Certain pitches won. We formed teams around those ideas, and then those teams went on to workshop the idea. And during the pitches, I'm thinking about it now, the professor, he has this like huge personality. He kept on correcting me he was like, "You're moving around too much." And so I would start talking and he would like stop me. And I'm standing there in front of the whole class and he'd be like, "Start over. You need to like stand still while you're giving this pitch." And I had to start over like over and over again. It was super difficult, super embarrassing. And now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, am I moving around now? That was a super cool experience. Like, you do not get that at all in a computer science class where you just have to go in and listen and leave and write some code. So I found that to be, yeah, super valuable.
Yeah, sometimes those experiences which are very uncomfortable in the moment, very embarrassing in the moment, tend to be either just great stories to tell after graduating and funny stories to tell, or also a lot more and like valuable life lessons. And so I'm guessing, like from what I'm understanding, that one class sort of made you in a positive way conscious about the way you're sort of using your body language when you're talking, like even on camera right now. And so that stuck with you for years. Also, like we'll double down on what you said about professors. In my opinion, the greatest professors, beyond just being extraordinary academics, are like also inspiring extraordinary human beings. And so, as much as we learn from them about their knowledge on subject area, I feel like it's also valuable to learn from their story and their worldview, and sort of their values, the kind of human being that they are. A lot of them have very unconventional journeys, which sort of are beyond your wildest imaginations. But most of us never even take the like pain of asking. And so I've had like extraordinary stories come up, and this is sort of through hosting the Humans of Minerva podcast, where I sort of have an excuse to talk to professors for an hour and a half, 2 hours about just their journey. And I was like, wow. And now I do that even beyond the podcast, like going to their office hours and doing this. Um, it's been a very like comprehensive conversation. I think we've touched on so much ground. We started with sort of computer science, AI. Is it worth it to go to college? We touched on your application. We talked about WashU, like regrets, what to optimize for, not being like don't be valedictorian is what came out of that segment. And yeah, we talked about study abroad and internships, spending summer. I feel like it's been like a very 360-degree conversation, which is how I love a lot of these episodes to be. If someone were to only watch this episode, I still feel like they get a lot of aspects of the college experience. Also been interesting for me as a host. A lot of guests I have on, the moment I finished the question, they begin the answer. And so either they've thought through it before, or they're just sort of very spontaneous in terms of answering, which is great. What I found different about you, which is also something very interesting, which I have to work on personally, is sort of being very thoughtful and all, and taking a moment, taking two deep breaths, getting to the answer. And I also feel like while you're answering, you're doing your thought experiments in your mind and you're thinking through things before answering. So while that might be like slower than someone who's rehearsed, I feel like it's valuable that you're not coming into the podcast with like predetermined opinions. You're sort of really listening to the question and then answering. So just wanted to call that out. I in that sense, it's been a different episode, a special one for the 25th. And so that's sort of that one comment I'll make. But as we begin wrapping up, to fast forward a little and give viewers an idea as to where you're headed. You've already spent quite a few months being a freelancer, working on AI projects as an independent sort of in consulting. Do you foresee a similar path continuing over the next 2-3 years, or do you feel like there's a pivot that's going to be coming soon?
So overall, I'm not sure where I'll end up in the next few years. There's one path that's interesting to me, which is research into AI safety, because I think that is super, super important as AI systems get more and more powerful. And also just a general direction that I imagine my career will take is one of more and more responsibility and probably more focus. And so I wouldn't be surprised if eventually I end up in some role that's more focused as opposed to being a contractor to multiple companies. But there's still a very broad field of different paths that could take.
Lovely. Keeping options open. And I mean, every year of college, you're changing as a person. I'm sure every year after college, you're also changing rapidly as a person. And so, being open-minded, I think, is a common takeaway I have from all episodes. And this is not just professionally, it is also about your personal views, because the way you see the world entering college is so different from the way you see the world sort of a year down the line or at graduation. So I think that's a good way to wrap up the majority of the episode. We'll sort of dive into the fast fire round. and then get on to the conclusion. So in terms of the fast fire round, these are just a few quick questions which I'll be very quickly throwing at you, and the challenge for you is to be answering in one short phrase or one sentence. So we sort of pick up the pace and make it a little bit more exciting and fast paced before we do the final wrapping up. But I would love to begin with any one special memory from the 4 years at WashU in a sentence.
Me and my friends used to climb the buildings, climb up the faces of the buildings, because there are these nice, like, craggy stones, and that was super fun.
With a safety harness, I'm hoping.
No, I think we had a crash pad at some points, so we had some safety in place.
Okay. What's a book recommendation to a young adult, a high schooler listening to this episode?
So I really enjoyed the book called Gödel Escher Bach. It's kind of long and hard to get through, and but it's like super beautiful and mathy, and draws all these connections between like genetics and computer science and music and art in this super awesome way. It's just like my favorite book. I wouldn't recommend it specifically to a young adult. I would just recommend it to anyone who has the time to read it.
Yeah, interesting. And you've given a bunch of recommendations. I'll make sure to put those in the description as well, so that people can go ahead and go deeper if they're interested. Number 3, one programming tip or resource recommendation for someone just getting started, or a beginner who's hoping to pursue something along the lines of computer science at university.
Yeah, so I feel like the most important thing is to do something that's fun. Earlier we talked about the personal website. I think that could be very fun. I think also making simple games could be fun, but that's kind of, if you can have fun, you can keep on learning, I think.
Yeah. And that applies more broadly beyond computer science, I think, as well. What is the most challenging aspect? What has been the most challenging aspect of your 4-year journey at WashU?
Having to move out when COVID started was very difficult.
And yeah, being detached from the community, I'm sure is also very difficult, which I'm sure has become like full of friends and professors and mentors. So COVID is a difficult time, especially for all of you in university, I'm sure. We'll end with 2 more specific AI fast fire questions, because I'm also interested to pick your brain a little here. So firstly, I would love if you could share with us a concept or any piece of jargon which you feel is worth doing a deep dive on after this episode for anybody who's interested.
I think code search is a really interesting category of things. I don't know if that's actually the perfect keyword, but there are a lot of papers about training models to generate code that is specifically tailored to a particular task. So some of these examples have been like solving or proving math problems. Researchers have found that this can be much easier using AI systems if you're able to first create a very specific language that the system might be more easy to produce and train it on that language. And there's been some really cool progress with that.
Okay, and that's something for me to check out after the episode as well. Because I'm sort of also I'm not in the field, but I feel like this has almost become a life skill, knowing the basics of AI and being able to use these tools in whatever work you're doing. And lastly, I'm really going to push you to be specific here. And someone who's watching this in 2030 can confirm if we're correct. But what's any one AI or AGI prediction for the world of 2030?
I mean, this will probably happen sooner than that, but I think at that point, AI agents that can automate things on your computer and work with you on the operating system level and automate a lot of common knowledge work tasks will probably be available at that point, and that's going to have a huge effect on how
work looks. Work will become a lot higher level, and be more creative, and optimistically we'll have less grunt work. And maybe around 2030, that's when things are going to be perfect, and we're still going to have jobs, but they're going to be a little easier. After that, we might start to lose our jobs.
After that, it's doomsday. But 2030 might just be that sweet point. That's an interesting prediction. Lastly, if you had to conclude what's been a really special 25th episode on Uni Unveiled by leaving one final message to listeners. So I'm assuming these are high schoolers about to embark on the journey of university and then get into life at large. What's one final thing you want to leave them with?
I think the most important thing for me has always been the people who I get to spend time with. And I think being conscious of who you surround yourself with is super, super important. Actually, in all kinds of things that you surround yourself with. There's this guy I like listening to, Thich Nhat Hanh, is a monk and a teacher, a Buddhist monk, and he talks about taking in things that are nourishing to you, and that a lot of kind of bad things can be attributable to your broader diet, which is not just food, but like the circumstances you put yourself in. And that includes the people you surround yourself with, that includes the media you consume, that includes the thoughts that you have. I mean, that's tricky to control, but I think on all of those counts, I think it's valuable to be intentional about the circumstances you put yourself in, and specifically with people. I think being around people who are inspiring to you is really important. And maybe there's this other direction of like media and all of that. And I think social media can be really tricky to manage. And so having a handle on that as well, and not inundating yourself with other ideas, with random people's ideas that you can't control, I think is also super valuable. I'm personally off most social media. So maybe that ended up being kind of two different sides of things, but they're all in the broad category of like being conscious of what kind of environment you put yourself in.
What's your like number one reason for being off of more social media?
Partially, it didn't feel like a useful use of time. But I think there's also this big thing about like, I don't like the person who I am when I'm scrolling. And I think that the algorithms don't care about you, and they care about making you into an impulsive person who likes staring at whatever this thing is. And each social media site is very different. So I have like very different things to say about like Instagram versus Twitter. Instagram was a long time ago that I deleted it. So I don't really remember my reasons, but I think it was probably something to do with just cultivating this care about what other people look like, and sort of this like very heightened social consciousness, which can be unhealthy. I mean, that's probably the through line through all these different social media sites. Obviously, it creates this really heightened consciousness of what other people are doing socially. It like ties you really thickly into this network. And I think it's healthy to be less tightly tied and to be a little bit more of your own person with your own ideas, because already you're not going to be not tied to the world. Like if you're a person in, if you're going to college, like you're going to be surrounded by all these ideas already. I think you get more than enough exposure. Twitter is really great for a lot of reasons, but it also had enough downsides that I turned it off. But Twitter is cool I have had positive professional networking going on there, but that kind of detracts from my overall point about social media. But everything in moderation, everything has two sides. But That's the overall feeling about it.
No, agreed. Yesterday, I sort of wanted a mental break from work, spent half an hour just scrolling through YouTube, and then like I genuinely couldn't stop myself. Like I didn't feel like I was in control, and so even I like you, I am just off of most social media. And my reason is simple: is that I don't trust myself enough, or I don't have enough self control at this point to know that I will be able to only use it in the way I want to and not sort of waste time there or get addicted. And so I'm sort of just keeping that fear completely at bay and not even taking the first step. So that's my reason. Lastly, we'll end with just a documentary recommendation. If you have not seen it, please watch The Social Dilemma. Even if it doesn't make you delete your social media, you will sort of begin using them more mindfully and intentionally, is the least I will say. But I think we'll leave it at that. That was a really good way to conclude. Brilliant. If a listener really enjoyed this conversation, is curious to hear more, wants to connect, probably has follow up questions, what do you think is a good way to reach you?
So I'd be super happy to connect with whoever. You can reach me at, there's lots of different ways to reach me on my website, danielsosebee.com. You can email daniel@harmonic.so, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I guess not Twitter because I have it blocked right now. And yeah.
Yeah, and I'll definitely link your personal website in the description. That should be a good way to find your contact info, as well as a good inspiration for anybody who's inspired to sort of begin building their own. I feel like yours is even gave me 2 or 3 interesting ideas from mine. So that's a very positive sign. But other than that, thank you for like helping me with this 25th episode. Thank you for your wise words on Uni Unveiled, and it was my pleasure to have you on the podcast, Daniel.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure as well.
All right, that was the episode. To all the young listeners out there, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you feel more energized, inspired, and curious for the exciting university journey that lies ahead. Stay tuned. Many more wonderful episodes to be released on Uni Unveiled across a diversity of majors, countries, institutions, and speaker profiles. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Uni Unveiled. This podcast is just a small part of a much larger initiative undertaken by my family called Serene Strokes to spread positive sparks of growth, transformation, and joy among all our audience. Check out our official website www.serenestrokes.com. In the description and comments, please feel free to share other topics and questions which you would love to hear about from our different speakers on this podcast. Until then, take care and remember that this big word, university, may not be as scary or as intimidating as you think it is. Thank you for listening to Uni Unveiled.